Okay, everybody, this is going to be your first of many videos that I'm going to create for you guys that discuss the images that you make for our assignments. So this is a really important part of the class, so I encourage you to watch the whole video, not just the parts that your own images are in, because there's going to be takeaways from virtually every single one of your images that you guys can learn from. Really, the foundation of fine arts is that we look at images, we point out the things in them that are very successful, and then we suggest some refinements or some improvements that ultimately will help clarify the way that you make your images so that the outcome or the final print matches the original intent of what you're trying to do. So in other words, we want you to be able to fully control what's going on in your image all the time. So with that being said, I want everybody to put your egos aside. The critiques or the feedback that you might hear is not personal. It's really just meant to help you improve your photography. So that being said, let's get started. So first of all, we have Kenny's images here. And just a reminder, we're trying to do a blurred image and a frozen image for this first assignment here. So first image, the blurred one, we've got the lines of the car. It looks like the headlights of the car are very much blurred, while the pavement itself is very sharp and in focus. And typically this happens when we have a shutter setting that is very long. So in other words, the picture takes a long time to take, and we have the camera on a stable surface, whether that's a tripod or putting it on the ground or someplace where the camera itself is not going to move. So in this instance, it looks like that is indeed the case. And then we check out the file information, which I'm going to be doing this a lot with your images to find out some of the information that's embedded in the file. So I don't see any information embedded in here, so I can't tell you what the exact shutter settings or f-stop settings were on the camera, but certainly to me this looks like a very successful image in terms of getting that long blurring correct. If I had to guess, it's probably several seconds long because the car had to travel from this spot all the way to this spot in the image. So certainly for me, that definitely works. The one thing that I might suggest here is that your background is really, really dark. And perhaps if you had taken this image maybe a little bit closer to dusk, sort of like that magic hour when the sun goes below the horizon, but it is still kind of a little bit light in the sky. So, we've got that orange glow or just a little bit of light. That would help kind of open up this background or make this background a little bit lighter. So it wouldn't be so dark. And I guess, a lot of the details of that building are being hidden. So for me, that's really the one improvement here. But other than that, I think this is a really super job with the long exposure. You've got the blurring of the car headlights and the pavement very much being frozen up here. And the other thing that I really like that, we'll talk about a little bit more as the semester progresses, is you've got these great lines. And all of these lines sort of draw our eye into the photograph. So, they're starting at the right-hand corner of the frame and then just pushing towards the center of the frame, towards these buildings and these lights in here, which I think all really contribute to this being a really, really wonderful image. So just maybe taking the image a little bit earlier, but other than that, I think it is definitely a wonderful example of a blurred shot. And then if we take a look at your second image, this is your frozen shot, and you said it's your brother coming down the slide. We are always looking for what I like to call that decisive moment, or that moment where sort of like all of the action comes to a pinnacle. And to me, it looks like, excuse me, that pinnacle of action happens every time he comes over each one of these bumps on the slide here. So, as he comes over the bump, kind of like the arms go up in the air, and there's a big expression of joy in there. So I feel like you really did catch that decisive moment, although perhaps maybe just a split second earlier when those arms are straight up in the air might have been ideal. But other than that, again, it looks pretty frozen up. The action, the movement. We've got sort of the potato sack, or the thing that he's riding on, is pretty frozen. Everything looks really good here. I guess the one thing I would just say is that the information on this side of the frame, is that really critical to the photograph? I kind of feel like, we don't really need it in the image there. So if I was working with this image, I probably might get a little bit closer to the slide, or if we were to work with, Post or working in Photoshop, I might crop it a little bit tighter so the image just looks like this. It's a little bit tighter, a little bit more focused on the information that is exciting or aesthetically pleasing, which is, your brother coming down that slide. So I think that, again, would just be the one refinement here. But again, I think you've done just a really fantastic job with freezing up that action in the photograph here. Again, let's see if your data's embedded. Yeah, your data is embedded here. I see you're using an iPhone for your images, which ideally I would prefer that you did not use an iPhone, because with the iPhone, unless you have some third-party apps as plugins that you can control that exposure, I prefer that you use the DSLR, that all of the shutter and aperture and ISO settings can be controlled. Because in here, you definitely had the right shutter setting. 1/750th of a second is definitely where I would have wanted you to be. So all these things are correct. I'm just concerned that with the iPhone, all of that stuff does it automatically for you. And I'd prefer that you actually manually set all of these things up on your own. That's kind of the purpose of this assignment and the purpose of using cameras with manual settings. So if you don't have an appropriate camera for this, go up to the Media Center on the 4th floor Lions, and you certainly can sign one out there and use that for all of your assignments. So then next up we have Zoe's images. So again, we're looking for the blurring from one shot, and then in the second image we're looking for a frozen action type of shot. So in the blur shot, certainly it's pretty obvious and evident that this little girl is blurred. And I think the thing that I really love about this image is when we think of a little girl, and I've got a 7-year-old daughter, and she is just absolutely full of energy. And certainly this girl also is probably loaded with energy. And having this blur in the photograph kind of conveys that sense of movement, of energy, of action, just the little girl running around and having a blast. So I think not only your technique here, which is fantastic, you've got the blur, but your technique also does a wonderful job of conveying this energy that she has. And, if we think about it, energy is really something that is kind of vague and is not something that's really easily visually portrayed. But in this sense, by using that slow shutter setting, you've gone ahead and created an image that does illustrate energy. So I think this is a great shot, and I absolutely love it. The lines that you've got going on here in the image are wonderful. They sort of, again, take us into the photograph. And when I say the lines, just where the arrow is going. So we got a line here and sort of a perceptual line here that really lead us into this image. And of course, her making eye contact, looking straight out into the frame at the viewer, I think creates a level of intimacy or connection with the subject in here that also makes this a really, really wonderful image. So great job on that. Let's take a look at your settings. So in Photoshop, we just go to File, Info, and it looks like you're using that wonderful Canon T5i. You've exposed it at 1/10 of a second. Awesome job on that. That's about where you should be. And corresponding f-stop of 14 and an ISO of 100. Fantastic. Looks like you're using the shutter priority exposure mode. And again, all really great decisions you've made there. And I think this is an awesome shot. So well done. And then a frozen shot, and we can see that clearly the look of this image and this image are very different. Now her hair is very sharp. Her movement is frozen up completely. You know, the edges of her arms and her dress and everything are very much clear and evident. And gosh, the thing that I love most about this image is that great smile or gesture on her face that I think is wonderful. And, you know, when we have frozen up images like this, it kind of allows us to begin to focus in on details in images. And, you know, one of the details that I love in the image is the little bandage on the knee with the heart on it there, which, you know, is probably in this shot, but, you know, it's really not evident as much in that shot. So two images that I think have a totally different look and feel to them, but essentially you've used the same subject. Really the only thing you've done differently is you've changed the settings on your camera. And that really is what this assignment is about, learning to create different looks and feels by changing the different settings on your camera. So fantastic job with this one too. We'll go in, take a look at your settings. 1/320th of a second, which is again pretty ideal for this. You're using the action program, which is intended to freeze up action on your camera. So lots of excellent decisions on your part. The one thing I would point out though is, you know, a little kid, they're kind of little and they don't move, you know, at hyper speed. Now, if you were shooting a you know, professional or even college level sports game where movement was really, really fast, then I probably would move this exposure setting up to 1/1000th of a second, just to be sure that I got things frozen up. So that shutter setting is very much proportional to how fast the subject is moving. And in this case, she's moving fast, but, you know, probably not professional sports fast. So just one thing to keep in mind if we were to change subjects and move to something that was moving a little bit quicker. Or even, you know, someone riding a bicycle or a car moving, something like that. You'd want to go a little bit faster in that exposure. So great job with this. Very well done. So next up we have Adalberto's photographs. How'd I do on the pronunciation on that? Hopefully pretty good. If I butchered it, please don't hold it against me. You can send me a little phonetical explanation of how I should pronounce that. But anyhow, one quick thing here. You submitted your images to me as a PDF, which for your reflections, that's okay to do the PDF, but I want you to submit the images separately so they're not embedded in your document. These should actually be uploaded as JPEGs, because the one thing I can't do is, if you saw the previous two students, I can't go in and do the file info because your photograph's embedded and it won't give me that stuff. So please, for future assignments, put the image that you create separately rather than the image that or the image embedded in the document. So anyhow, again, our objective here in this image is to freeze up action and movement And you've done that perfectly in this image. We can go in and take a look, and we can see that this bicycle rider is very much frozen. And in fact, I think the thing that I really love about this image is that the rider is at the stop sign, and he's kind of like he's frozen in a certain way, and it echoes what is being told or what's being written in the photograph with the letters on the stop sign here. So fantastic image, really love it a lot. I think it works really well, and again, that idea of sort of having the decisive moment where his arms are sort of suspended in midair in front of that spot really makes this image. I mean, think about it. If his hands were on the handlebars of the bike, I think this would be a totally different image. So from that perspective, I think it's great. Now, little refinements, boy, stuff like this is so spontaneous and it's happening so quickly. The thing that I'm going to suggest to you perhaps is not entirely realistic in this image, but just keep it in mind for future photographs. And that's this car in the background. Can you imagine if that car wasn't there and the bike rider was just isolated all by himself? I think that would be, that much more of an interesting and compelling image than having that car back there. So I think the car kind of interrupts his form or his shape in there, which I think really is the interesting thing about the photo. That silhouette of the kid with the arms outstretched. So now that being said, obviously, perhaps the car was stopped and, there was really no other option than to take it with that in the background. So I totally get that. I understand that. But, thinking down the road, always want to sort of isolate our subjects and separate them away from background things, and especially background things that can be kind of distracting, which I think in this case the car is. So just keep that in mind down the road. And then your blurred shot here. And again, we've got the appropriate shutter setting. We can see the slow movement of the people walking on the bike here in the background. And certainly, like our first image that we looked at, we've got some stillness or some frozenness combined with some blurring, which I think really works well here, because it takes a sign which can kind of be an inanimate object and brings it to life by having some movement in that photograph. And I think having that blurring and having that motion in there really helped sort of bring this scene to life and take it away from just being sort of a picture of a sign to a picture of a sign that is in the middle of a very lively and vibrant area. And I think especially, it looks like you took these images, in the middle of the city, and that environment is certainly, one that is very chaotic and alive with people and an energy and movement and so forth. So certainly having the blurring in that image works. Hopefully you wrote down what your settings were on your camera, because again, we can't really look them up here because your image is embedded. But to me, this looks like, maybe, I don't know, a 15th of a second or a 30th of a second is that nice blend between things that are moving, actually blurring, and then things that are static, like the sign being frozen up. So again, great shot. I like it a lot. I think both your images are super compelling. For future assignments, make sure you submit the JPEGs separately rather than embedding them. And next up, we have PJ's image. So first image, we've got the golfer swinging the golf head. And, interestingly enough, the golfer himself is frozen or reasonably in focus. and that golf head is moving. And the thing that I love about this, again, it has that idea of conveying energy through the use of this blurring technique, which is a shutter related technique. And we can almost kind of feel and hear the swing of the golf club because of that blurring in there. So, it transforms this scene from, one that's purely visual to one that, we can kind of hear the energy of the swing of the golf head. So really like it a lot. The one thing about this image that I think could be refined is I do think it is a little bit on the dark side, and I'm going to do a little adjustment here in Photoshop. These are layers that I'm working with here. We'll begin to talk about that a little bit down the road in the class, but we can see we kind of lighten that image up a little bit because it is a little bit on the dark side. So there's kind of before and there's after. I think that works a little bit better. So if we go in and we check out your file info, we see your exposure is at 1/125th of a second. And this is a great example how shutter settings and blur are very proportional. That head of the golf club is really moving super fast during a swing. So at 1/125th of a second, that is still actually going to be blurred. There's some other things, perhaps, like someone walking or, movement that isn't really fast, that will freeze up at 1/125th of a second. But for you and for the subject that you chose here, 1/125th actually blurred it. So great choice of shutter settings on this image. Now your second image here, this is kind of one that I think that you probably could have made some choices that would have led to a little bit stronger examples of freezing things up here. So if we go in and we look at your file info here, we see that you chose a shutter setting that actually was a little bit slower than the previous one. So if you're shooting the same thing and you're trying to freeze it, you should have actually gone to a much higher shutter setting on there. And quite honestly, this camera, I'm not super familiar with this camera, but I think this camera is pretty much fully automatic, and I'm just wondering if you had set this shutter setting or if the camera was making that choice for you. But in any event, we need to have a much higher shutter setting than this. So this should be like 1/500th of a second or 1/1000th of a second. And, if we were to go in here pretty close, we can see that whoever's swinging the bat here, their hands are a little bit blurry, and, even in the body area here, it's a little bit blurry. And you kind of cheated here. You cropped out the head of the golf club, which I'd be willing to bet anything that if it was included in the photo, it was going to be blurry, just like it was here. So I don't know, PJ. I think you're taking a little bit of a shortcut here on me. So perhaps if the camera's not letting you select these settings manually, it might be a good idea to go up to that media center and sign yourself out a camera that is going to be ideal for what we're trying to do in this class here. So again, 1/100th of a second might have frozen up, somebody walking, but someone swinging a golf club is a pretty fast action, and you really, really need that to be much higher than what you chose in this image here. So work on that and try to pay very close attention to that. The funny thing is, I think the blurring is maybe the harder of the two things here, and you got the blurring pretty much perfectly, but the frozen end of things, it looks like you got a little tripped up here, and I really suspect that the camera that you were using might not be the best choice for this particular assignment. So maybe think about that as you start working on our next series of assignments here. So next up we have Isaiah's images. And, I got to tell you, this is not easy to do what you've done in this image. You've got a frozen image indoors, especially of someone that is presumably, I mean, this is a Division I college basketball player, so presumably somebody that moves really, really fast. And looks like you've frozen him up really well. I mean, we can even see, the type on the basketball and the logos on the uniforms and so forth, pretty much frozen here. So fantastic job on that. I mean, really, really good job. And certainly gymnasiums are not the best place to take frozen images because the lighting is really bad. But, you seem to have nailed it pretty good here. So love that. And for everybody that's doing action shots, notice how he's really filled the frame with the subject. Pretty much from head to toe is what fills that whole frame there. And I think that is interesting because it really puts us up close and personal to the athletes, which, generally speaking, most of us are used to watching basketball games or whatever the sport is from the stands, which are very, very far away. So this image really sort of brings us down onto the basketball court and, puts us right in the middle of the, sorry about that, right in the middle of the action. So great job with this image. If you noticed, we've got in the file info area here, again, your camera data didn't transfer over. So I don't know why that is, but certainly, I suspect your shutter settings were probably 1/500th of a second, something like that. And then you've got your second image, and we can see in here the details are a little less sharp, and the image is a little more blurry, especially when we start looking at that logo there. That's pretty blurry, almost unreadable. So I like it, although I think you could blur it a little bit more. I think if we look back, especially like that image of the little girl, the second for Zoe's image, I think that was probably the best example so far of a blurred image. And I think that maybe your shutter setting, again, it's not embedded in your file info, but I'd be willing to bet it's probably, 1/125th of a second, or maybe 1/60th of a second. And you could go just a little bit slower to sort of emphasize that blur and just get a little bit more blurring in this photograph here. So, but other than that, great job on both of these. Certainly, you're a basketball player, so I think you probably see the game in a more refined and sophisticated way than the average viewer would. And I like the fact that you've kind of taken us in and given us, a bird's eye view or a player's eye view, better stated, of these subjects that we wouldn't probably normally see from a distance. So great job on that, and certainly some very compelling action images there. And then we will wrap things up here with Alexis's image or images. So our first one, our blur shot, certainly the water is blurring pretty nicely here. And again, water's something that's going to be moving pretty fast. So especially the fact that you've got some frozen and some blurring here, probably makes me guess that you're somewhere in the 1/125th range, something like that. 1/800th range. Okay. So again, we can kind of see how that blurring is very proportional to the speed of the subject. So we've got water that's moving super, super fast, and it is still being blurred because it's just moving really, really fast. So, good job on that. I really like how the water is really bright, and you photographed it on a dark green. So not only is it kind of an interesting photograph, but the fact that you're using a light on a dark, I think really makes those water droplets stand out even that much more. So pretty neat shot, and I love the fact that you've got frozen and blur in the same exact image. So I think that's a pretty awesome shot. And then the next shot, we've got some looks like the raindrops right when they're hitting the tray full of water. Let's take a look at shutter settings. So 1/320th of a second, certainly good enough to freeze action up. The one thing I want to point out here is that, sort of the difference here is we're looking down on something. So when you look down on something, the movement isn't going to be as exaggerated as it's going to be in this image where the movement is across the frame. So when something's kind of crossing in front of the frame, it perceptually is seen as being much faster than when we're looking straight down on something, where sort of the change of movement is kind of less than it would be when it's moving across. So again, I think this certainly is a good example of something frozen up, although I would have to say that, in an ideal world, I would love to see this number a lot higher, maybe like 1/800th of a second, like the previous one. But, when we start looking at all the parts, well, you're pretty high on your ISO anyways. And to get this shutter setting any higher, we'd have to move this ISO setting up higher because, all these things correspond to each other. If we were to move the shutter setting higher to get correct exposure, we also need to move that ISO setting higher. Now, if we do that, we're going to begin to introduce a lot of noise into the image. So, it's kind of a balance. You want to find that sweet spot where you're going to freeze things up, but you're not going to introduce too much noise into the photograph. And I think in this image, you made some good choices, and ultimately you ended up doing that. So anyhow, good job with this assignment, everybody. It looks like that you pretty much all are on the right track here so far. A couple little minor things that I think we need to correct and maybe refine the technique a little bit. Just, a reminder for those of you that are using cameras that probably aren't ideal for the class, thinking of the iPhone and the Canon PowerShot. Certainly go up to the Media Center, sign yourself out a camera. It doesn't cost you anything. We loan them out for free. So do that, and I think you're going to find, especially as we continue to advance our technical skills, that having those little bit more advanced cameras are going to help you out with your techniques. So well done, everybody, and look forward to our next critique session, which will come after your assignments that are due today are submitted. So we will see you down the road here. Thanks.